And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio Network and Progressive Radio Network and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and at opednews.com/podcasts, where the complete archives are. My guest for this show, and I'm really pleased to have him, is Charles Eisenstein. He's an author and a speaker known for his books, The Ascent of Humanity, Sacred Economics, and The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know is Possible, and Climate: A New Story. His website is charleseisenstein.org. And he offers a vision and a message that we really need. And so I want to start off. How do you want your writing and speaking to make change happen?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for asking that.
And one more. What are the three most important ideas you want people to get from you? Because I think they go together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this is a question I ask myself. Given all that's happening in the world, why do I decide that the best thing to do about it is to write a book or to write an article or something? And really what it comes down to is the understanding that the world runs on a mythology, or you could say on a deep programmatic story. And my intention and my job is to contribute to a change in that story, to shift the mythology of civilization. So that's what I hope that my words, my writing, my speaking contributes to. And then if you wanted me to say the three most important things, it would be basically the tributaries to a new mythology, or the understanding of what the old mythology actually is. So it's a transition from a story of self that says that we are separate beings in fundamental competition with each other. A story of the people that says humanity is here to overcome nature, to conquer one frontier after another, to attain a paradise of control through domination, through technology, that we are fundamentally separate from nature. Like, these are all elements of an old story that I believe is in a state of advanced decay, and therefore offering us a chance to tell a new story of why we are here and even what a person is. So this new story then, this isn't like some arid philosophy. This has everything to do with our basic operating systems, like money, like technology, like politics. So that's kind of the big picture. And I don't know, usually I don't like to start with the big picture because it seems abstract, but since you asked, there it is. But yeah, we can talk about anything and it'll ultimately lead back to that place.
Okay, so there's a story that basically came with civilization, with agriculture, with the domestication of animals in the land. Is that what you're talking about?
Yep, that's it. And division of labor, social classes, money, debt, slavery, warfare, patriarchy, the whole thing as a self-reinforcing gestalt that has reached its pinnacle in our time.
And what are the dominant themes that you've explored regarding this story in your books?
Take your pick. I go into different systems. So I wrote one book on how this basic mythology is expressed in our money system. So, for example, we have a money system that casts us into competition and necessitates the endless growth of the human realm. Mathematically, like it's built into the structure of money as it is created in our current system. So it puts us into competition with each other because there's always more debt than there is money. There's an artificial scarcity of money. And scarcity is one of the precepts of not only standard economics, but it's even in like physics, with the idea that the universe tends toward entropy, and that therefore a comfortable human realm can only be maintained by fighting the forces of nature. So this is like a fundamental mythology. And it seems pretty true in a market economy that, where everyone's in it for themselves and everyone's trying to get the best deal. And there's never quite enough. And security depends on having more than other people. It seems like that's just a truth of human nature, but it's actually a consequence of the system that we're in. If we were in a hunter-gatherer society, a gift culture, where your good fortune in, like, say, the hunt is good news for me because now there's going to be a feast, or that your talents, say you're a great musician, that's good news for me because I'm going to enjoy your music. And I see my whole life that whoever is fortunate is then the most generous person. And I see my whole life that whoever's in need will receive abundantly. Then I'm not going to be greedy. I'm not going to be insecure. I'm going to be naturally generous. And I'm going to see human nature in a very different way than I see it in a competitive market economy. I know that I'm taking a kind of a distilled version of that, but that's an example.
That's great. We do a weekly Zoom session for Op-Ed News, and I brought up about the Hobbesian lie about, how before civilization people were these brutish, struggling people, where the truth is totally the opposite of that. And one of the people observed that recently they found that among hunter-gatherers, in the rare occasion when they actually have meat, the hunters, as a kind of code of honor, make sure that everybody gets it before they do. And that's a gift economy. That's a kind of a code of honor that it would be nice to see now. Imagine that.
Yeah. There was I quoted one hunter-gatherer in one of my books where the anthropologist is like, you're a good hunter, you make a big kill, you've got a lot of meat, you could smoke it, you could store it. Why don't you do that? And the hunter-gatherer was like, you don't understand. I store meat in the belly of my brother.
Beautiful.
I hold a feast, and then when someone else has abundance, I'm invited to their feast.
Yes.
I store meat in the belly of my brother. So simple.
What I wrote about in my book, Bottom Up Revolution, is connection consciousness. And that is the way that people existed before civilization, where they thought about each other and they worried about how all the people in the hunter-gatherer band, because they weren't even tribes, how they were going to survive and how they were going to function and how the nature around them was going to be able to be. And that was a normal way to think. That was the thinking process. That was part of the story that they had. And you talked about the story that we have now, but what's the story that replaces it? Is it going back to the indigenous story?
It draws on indigenous roots, but it is a new incarnation of that story. This is where I differ from some of the radical anti-civilization people who, think that agriculture was just a gigantic mistake.
I just had Chris Ryan on, Civilized to Death.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I've talked to Chris actually, and I don't think he would disagree with me that this whole journey of separation is moving us toward an evolutionary purpose that requires this journey, and that our destination is not to say, well, that was a big mistake, let's go back to living in hunter-gatherer bands, but it is to bring some of the understanding of the animistic hunter-gatherer into civilization. And that, in fact, is the fulfillment of this stage of civilization, is to recover those lost truths and to move into a story of interbeing. I like to use Thich Nhat Hanh's term for it, interbeing, which is a bit more than just interdependency, which is a good step, to say that, yeah, we depend on nature uh, inseparably, that our well-being is tied to the well-being of the rainforests and of the oceans, and we're not really separate. Like, that's a good step. But beyond interdependency, interbeing says that it's not just a conditional dependence. Well, we need the rainforest to produce oxygen, or we need the oceans to modulate the climate, or we need the soil to produce food. But maybe technology someday could replace all of these things with carbon-sucking machines and hydroponics factories, and we won't need nature anymore. Interbeing says, no, the rainforests, the soil, the whales, the elephants, all of these beings are part of ourselves. And when they go extinct, when they are destroyed, something in us dies as well. And that when our connections to the world are sundered, then we become less. And I think that our current modern experience bears this out, because our material needs, maybe not consistently, but in general, at least for the affluent, are met in abundance and superabundance. Yet, if you want to find happy people, don't go to Beverly Hills. Don't go to the Hamptons. You go to a village in Ivory Coast or Peru, or Bangladesh, and the people might be poor, but if you've ever had that experience of going somewhere remote and like, oh gosh, I forgot what a happy person looks like. So in modern society, where so many of our relationships to each other and to nature are cut off or are very one-dimensional, attenuated, we don't feel like whole. We don't feel like we're at home in the world, that we belong. We're not held in this matrix of relationship. And that poverty of being drives all kinds of addictions, all kinds of acquisitiveness. Like, you're trying to fill the void, you're trying to replace these lost connections with something that's inside the domain of the separate self, and no amount is enough. So this is the misery of the modern separate self, and part of the breakdown of the story built on that narrow experience of being.
So you get into in great detail this breakdown of the connection between the indigenous world, between nature, between each other. Talk a little bit more about that breakdown.
Well, what's natural for a human being is to, look outside or be outside and know the name of every single plant that you see, and know the habits of every animal, and know the story behind every human face. It is a rarity in human history for me to look at you, Rob, and not know the name of your grandfather and how your grandparents met, and where you liked to play the most when you were a kid. Like, normally I would know 1,000 stories about you.
It reminds me, when I graduated from college, I took a trip around Europe, and I spent a little time in Crete. I ended up in a little town on the south side of Crete called Myrtos. And I got to know some of the locals, and they showed me the shoreline, and there were rocks sticking out of the water, and they had names for each rock. And those names were given to them by the Phoenicians 7,000 years ago. That's what we're talking about.
That's what I'm talking about. That is what gives people an experience of being home in the world. And if you don't have that fundamental security that comes from this embeddedness and these relationships, then that insecurity, I mean, of course you have to accumulate money and power as a substitute for that basic belongingness. And I could talk historically about how this grew, through the separation from nature, through agriculture, and then industry, warfare, colonialism, all the things that have uprooted people and disconnected people. It's a huge story, which suggests that the healing is equally profound and has to go equally deep. The healing of our society is not a matter of, oh, one political party comes in and it's better than the other one, and they make better laws and tweak some things. Everyone knows that the crisis of our society and of humanity, it goes all the way to the bottom, of who we think we are, how we relate to each other, what we believe to be real. And that's why I speak in terms of mythology, because mythology answers the question, who are you? Why are you here? How does change happen? What's real? Where did you come from? Where are we going? That's mythology. And that's why I'm not saying to just focus on mythology and don't do anything about the immediate problems of the world, but whatever we do about the immediate problems of the world has to be informed by the deeper understanding of our mythological situation.
So talk a little bit more about that, what we need to be informed in the deeper understanding. Could be.
Sure. I mean, I could pull, different, I think maybe I could pull different strands that are braided together into the dominant narrative, into the dominant mythology. So one of them would be Walter Wink, the theologian, called it the myth of redemptive violence, which essentially says that the problem in the world is evil that takes the form of a bad guy. And the solution is conquest, to defeat the bad guy. He gives the example of Popeye. Like, the problem is Brutus or Bluto. What was his name?
Bluto.
Bluto, yeah. That's the problem. And the solution is that Popeye beats him up. Problem solved. This is the template for so much. Problem, crime. Reason? Well, obviously criminals, right? Criminals cause crime. There's the bad guy right there. Solution, lock him up. Problem, terrorism. The cause, obviously it's terrorists.
Okay.
Solution,
my history of story goes along these lines. I got really into it, so that back in 2002, I founded and organized the first conference on the summit meeting on the art, science, and application of story, bringing all the different worlds of story together: mythologists, psychologists, screenwriters, novelists, neuroscientists, psychologists. And one of the things I've learned, and I think I've got some expertise in story after all these years, having interviewed many, many people, is that you need to have an antagonist. You need, the better the villain, the better the story. So what would be the villain in your new story?
Yeah, and so I would argue that that is not the only narrative form.
Okay.
That there are other plot lines. And that, so there's two things here though. One is, is there a villain at all? Secondly is, okay, if it is a plot line with a villain, is the resolution that the villain is defeated by force?
Okay.
Today, there are certainly a lot of bad things happening in the world and people are doing those things. Is that because they are bad people? Because, I'm privy to many narratives, many different realities, from like conspiracy theories to the most narrow orthodoxy. And they kind of have in common this idea, can be very subtle, that the solution is to finally expunge the bad guys. Like in one version, it's Bill Gates, and the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, and here are these evil people. But when you actually interact with people in those worlds, it's like, well, this guy isn't that evil. Maybe he's not that good, but he seems like, face to face is like kind of like everybody else. Like, where's the evil? So when we project evil as the cause of our problems, we become blind to other factors. We don't look. So to say, take the example of crime is caused by criminals, and you lock them up. Do you ever ask, well, what is causing criminals? What is causing criminality? What are their conditions? What are their economic conditions, their social conditions, biological inherited trauma, et cetera, et cetera? And if you don't look at those things, what you have is an endless war on crime, because you get a new crop of criminals and a new one and a new one. And at some point you're like, hold on, maybe even my response, like taking people out of their community and throwing them in prison, maybe that's actually part of the conditions that generate more crime. Maybe droning and bombing terrorists and, their entire families and wedding parties and so forth is part of the conditions that breed terrorism. Maybe this bad guy that I've set up includes myself. Maybe I'm not separate from the perpetrator. And this leads into confusion because, as you're saying, like our only plot line that we're familiar with from Hollywood is good versus evil, to the point where it seems like that is the only plot line. It's hard to find a movie that does not adhere to that. Maybe like some Miyazaki movies don't really adhere to that, where like we just watched Princess Mononoke. Are you familiar with Miyazaki?
Not real familiar, no. I
Yeah.
think I've seen Princess not Mononoke, but a long time ago.
Yeah. Like you can't really hold the kind of warlord lady as evil. It's like you can stand from in the perspective of any of the characters, and it just subverts that solution template of conquering evil. My Neighbor Totoro would be another one, but even the Lego movie. Do you remember did you see the Lego movie?
My kids are grown up. So.
Right. Well, I thought I was
I know
being
you guys
dragged.
Kids.
I thought I was being dragged into like a 2-hour toy commercial, right? So I go grumbling to the theater, and there's this will be a spoiler, okay? So if anyone has not yet seen it, and there's like a bad guy, Mr. Business, his name is, and he's wants to like freeze glue together the whole Lego world so that nothing can ever be destroyed or built anymore. And the heroes and the superheroes, they're like trying to fight him. And unlike most movies where the superheroes finally defeat the bad guy by force, near the end of the movie, Mr. Business has completely destroyed the heroes. They are helpless. And at a key moment, though, he has a change of heart. And I won't go into like how that change of heart came about, but he learns that he does not actually that he does not actually want to do what he had set out to do. And I think that this is a much more realistic formula for world revolution. It's not that we're going to defeat the military, industrial, pharmaceutical, agricultural, educational, financial, NGO industrial complex at its own game by being more ruthless and more expert in the application of violence than they are. It's that some portion of them are not really in it anymore. Their hearts are not in it, and they're stuck. They're stuck in a game that they do not believe in anymore. I know this to be true because I know a lot of people who are, in the, 0.01%.
So frame that within your idea of a new story. Where does this story go?
So a new story, for example, says it answers one of the questions that a new story or new mythology answers is, why am I here? What is the purpose of a human being? The old story says to survive and reproduce, to maximize your rational self-interest, And there is no purpose because there's no bigger plan, because all meaning is an imposition of the human intelligence onto a world that does not have intelligence fundamentally. Meaning, design, organization, beauty, these all originate in intelligence, and that's just human beings.
There's another concept that you talk about that I believe in, and that is a systems model, a systems way of thinking. I think
Yes.
you've talked about that. I write about it in my book. I think that this new story is inclusive of systems, whereas the old story, as you said, is about individuals. I think that's
right.
a piece of it, right?
Yeah, systems theory was a big tributary to my thinking when I realized that order, organization, beauty, intelligence can arise organically from complex systems. And you can look at these complex systems and it's like, wow, that is incredibly ordered and organized. Who wrote that blueprint? Who imposed that? No, it just happens because that's how reality is. And that leads to the conclusion that we as humans do not need to impose order onto a world that fundamentally has none, but we can listen for what wants to happen. We can participate in a much larger intelligence, and that therefore our purpose is to contribute to the unfolding of beauty and life in the cosmos.
And you have a book about it, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and sacred economics also goes into this a lot, like the idea that you are here to contribute to life and beauty on Earth. And this is a purpose that you don't have to take my word for it. You know, if you introspect for a while, you know that you are not here simply to maximize your safety and security and to survive life. Although our culture shouts that at us in many ways, like even with, public health policy, where seemingly death postponement is the most important thing, more important than fully living the life of the flesh. The denial of death in our culture is profound. The worship of safety. But there is a part of you, and anyone listening to this, that knows that you're not just here to survive life. I mean, you can't even, if you really think about it, it's incoherent. You're here to do something beautiful. Every teenager knows that they are here to do something magnificent, special, not necessarily more special than someone else, but there is a purpose for your being here that you know. I mean, you can try to deny it. You can accumulate $1 billion, but will you be satisfied with that? No, not if you're not contributing to something meaningful and beautiful to you. This is what the new story says, and the heart has always said. The new story, the story of interbeing, aligns the heart with the rational mind, because otherwise they are often in conflict.
All right, now I'm real into heart. I mean, I ran a conference on the brain where I basically said we're going to get into heart and spirit in looking at neuroscience. But what do you mean by heart? When you just refer to it, what does that mean?
I mean, the one way to say it is what you care about, what calls to your care, what calls to your compassion, what calls to your love. Like, what do you love in the world? What if you were guided by that? I'm not sure if I can define what it is to listen to your heart, because I think that it's unnecessary. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. Like, everybody has experienced these moments where the heart says one thing and the mind says something else.
Well,
and you have a choice.
My problem with that is that this disconnection that you refer to, this separation, is so profound that I don't think a lot of people do. I mean, I got into, one of the ways I got into positive psychology early on was I got fascinated with the idea of the heartwarming experience. What makes your heart glow?
Hmm.
And I learned about a study of endorphins where people would get chills up the back of their neck if they like heard a touching passage in a book or a movie, or if they watched a parade or things like that. And what blew my mind was half the population doesn't have that experience. It's been, I think it's shut off. So I think part of this story needs to be, I mean, I totally agree about the aspect of the heart, but everybody has the potential for it, but I'm not sure everybody's actually able to access it right now because it's so bad.
Yeah. And I would say that I don't always access it. I think there's a lot of healing to be done, a lot of barriers to fully feeling that need to be cleared out, a lot of armoring, a lot of um, dissociation. I mean, there's so many ways that our culture, I mean, it's not just trauma, but also standard parenting and schooling at every turn, dissociating us from the feelings and from the body and from the communication of the heart. So I think there's a lot of recovery that has to be done. And there's, people out there doing beautiful work, practitioners, teachers that are helping people reconnect to this primal source of information. But yeah, I mean, it is something that can be recovered though. And I think something that maybe you don't even notice it, but if you really think back and maybe this is part of the healing, I would just say that you know what I'm talking about. Anyone listening knows what I'm talking about. Like, you have a heart. It's speaking to you. You can feel it. I'm not going to even argue for that. I'm just going to declare that it's true.
Take a brief break, and when we get back, I want to learn what you mean by sacred in sacred economics. So we're going to, for the radio show, we're going to pause for about 25 seconds, and then we'll pick up.
Sure.
Okay, and my guest for the show is Charles Eisenstein. He's an author and speaker known for his books, The Ascent of Humanity, Sacred Economics, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible, and Climate, A New Story. His website is charleseisenstein.org. And we've been talking about the change in story we need. And we've been talking about how we have heart and we need to access more of that part of ourselves. And Charles has a released version of his book, Sacred Economics, just came out, a new edition. And I want to know what sacred and economics is. What is sacred? What is, and how can economics be sacred?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like if anything in the world is not sacred, it's money. Like, it's the very epitome of profane. And in the book, I ask, well, why should that be? Because money is simply a set of agreements that assigns value to symbols. So why have we done that in a way that makes money so often a force for harm in the world? So, like, what would it be to make money as sacred as everything else in the world?
But what is sacred?
What is sacred? Yeah. So in the book, I describe sacred as, to the extent that it can be defined at all, I say it's a function of two things. One is uniqueness, and one is relationship. So uniqueness, like, if I see you, Rob, as just a member of a category, as, say, a consumer, or as, an ethnic or racial category, something, if I devalue you and dehumanize you, then I'm not seeing your uniqueness. And I'm making you, in my view, no longer sacred. If I am ignorant of where you came from and where and your relations, like, because you're not just a separate individual. So to see your uniqueness, I also have to see your relationships, the unique place in the matrix of relationships that you occupy.
Okay, now when you say that, it makes me think of callousness, because somebody who doesn't pay attention to that is callous. And that callousness makes me think of psychopaths and narcissists, because they tend to be callous. And
Right.
I think we're living in a world that is just flooded with narcissism and psychopathy. And it has a big role to play in this story that we need to replace. That story ignores those kinds of aspects, those sacred aspects of just relating to and seeing other people. And I love the way you put it that way, because that is so basic. I mean, if you look at some of the early art from the Middle Ages, you see saints with glows around them. And what you're really describing is, see that about everybody.
Right. Because ultimately it's true. Whatever judgment you hold about somebody, whatever dehumanizing judgment you hold about somebody, it means that you're not fully seeing them. Something's missing. And so this psychopathy, this narcissism that is inundating our culture, it's actually created by our systems, to a large extent created by our money system, which on one, and our economic system, which on one hand, through the phenomenon of the commodity, makes material reality into a bunch of things that are not unique and that are not related. Like you have like a standard, nail, okay, like a metal nail. It's identical because it's mass produced to every other nail, and you have no idea its origins. It's abstracted from a web of relationship, and the only relationship you have is the relationship of price. So money basically telescopes a million relationships into one relationship, a million values into one thing called value, and makes everything interchangeable for one thing, which is money. So that gets us used to thinking in the world in that way and seeing the world, including each other, in that way. And even if you are a very kind, compassionate person, if you go online to buy something and the same product is available on this website for $30 and on that website for $20, most people are going to take the $20 one. You're not going to think, well, gosh, I think I'd like to pay the $30 because then the entrepreneur will be able to pay his employees better. Or all you see when you do comparison shopping is the price. That's what is visible to you. The relationships, like the ecological relationships behind that product, the social relationships, those are not visible. So, and this isn't just like, that you are selfish. I mean, people are in a situation where they have to save that $10. So the system is geared toward the erasure of uniqueness and of relationship. That's the situation that we are in right now. And the question then, how do we recover? That's what sacred economics is about. How do we recover sacredness in economic life? And it leads to like some very nuts and bolts, policies, but it's also philosophical and spiritual. I mean, in the sense of who am I in the world?
So you got a big book here. Give us a couple examples of some of the ways that we do it.
Some of the ways that we find our way back, you mean?
Yes. How do we get back to sacred economics?
One thing I talk about is to change the way that money is created. So today it's created through interest-bearing debt, and it doesn't have to be created that way. It could be created with negative interest, for example. It doesn't have to be lent into existence by banks. It could be issued to people as a universal basic income. And I know that both of these proposals negative interest and UBI have a shadow side and have like some complications in their implementation, which I'm not going to go into deeply right now, but I just want to say for those who are skeptical of them that I'm aware of these problems. Like, for example, the seeming necessity to abolish cash to have a negative interest system that then leads to totalitarian possibilities, which is kind of already happening. But anyway, negative interest on money no longer rewards you for merely possessing money and encourages sharing, encourages, it discourages accumulation and encourages flow, and eventually can recreate conditions in an archaic society where possessions, too many possessions, were a burden. If you hold a lot of grain, the grain will rot. If you have a lot of bread, the bread will go stale. Much better to share it, to generate generosity, to generate gratitude in the community, and store meat in the belly of your brother. So how, like, that is easy to envision in a hunter-gatherer society in a small scale, where, you know, the largest social unit was maybe 500 people. But how do you translate that into a mass economy? Well, you have to make possessions a burden again, i.e. money a burden. So it's a negative interest rate on money. So it motivates lending at zero interest. And then you could basically erase, you could basically cancel all debt or some large amount of debt, or reduce the interest rate on third world debt, on credit card debt, on student loan debt to zero. Debt is a big part of this. Debt is part of the program of control.
It's also a big part of the lie too about money. You know, this whole idea that we only have such a limited amount that, you know, we certainly learned differently during COVID-19 about how much could be spent.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to
Yep.
get into COVID-19 with you shortly. But we need to take another quick break and then we'll be back.
Yeah, the sacred economics topic is like, it really takes like at least an hour to really, you know, go into some of the specifics.
And my guest for the show is Charles Eisenstein. He's an author and speaker known for his books, The Ascent of Humanity, Sacred Economics, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible, and Climate: A New Story. And I know that you can just barely touch on what's in this book, Sacred Economics. And I'm not trying to get you to do that, because I think that I've watched a bunch of your interviews and videos, and I wanted to get just like a bigger picture of where you're at, where you're going. So, but what I'd like to do is, where does this new story, how does Sacred Economics come into this new story?
Well, it's part of humanity rejoining nature. Part of humanity understanding ourselves as ecological beings, not separate from the world. Because our current money system requires endless growth. What does growth mean? Growth means the conversion of nature into products and relationships into services. So to be an ecological species, eventually we have to stop growing. That doesn't mean we stop developing. That doesn't mean our consciousness and our art and our science stop developing. But it means we stop making more and more of nature ours.
I think that
stop monetizing everything.
I think that our current economic concept of growth is malignancy.
Yes,
it's
like a cancer. Yeah.
Yes, and the idea of systemic growth within ecosystems is one that involves balance. Balance has to be a part of it.
Well, there is a phase in an ecosystem, there is a phase of rapid growth, like say after a fire, or if there's like bare ground, you do have headlong competition for soil and sunlight, and each species trying to outcompete the other. And that lasts for a little while. And then it reaches a more complex phase, much more symbiotic, much more interrelational, and it reaches a steady state where competition is not the dominant force. A human being also goes through a state of rapid growth in childhood and then reaches adulthood and stops getting bigger and bigger and develops in other ways. Humanity as a collective, I think, is reaching that point as well, where we're ready to transition into another kind of development that doesn't mean more and more of us, and it doesn't mean a bigger and bigger footprint on Earth, but it's a different mode of development. That is what maturity is for our species, but we still have an economic system that is aligned with growth. It is no longer a match to our consciousness, our ecological consciousness, for example. That's why we need a different story of money, a different kind of money.
So you originally wrote Sacred Economics how many years ago?
Like 10 years ago, 11 years ago.
And the new edition just came out. How has your thinking about Sacred Economics changed?
The new edition is like 80 or 90% the same. I put in some stuff on crypto and I refined some of the ideas. I have become more skeptical of monetizing ecosystem services than I was. And let's see, what else did I change in there? It's mostly, I just updated some things. There's a lot of reference to the 2008 financial crisis that I've updated, but not a lot of big changes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What about crypto?
Again, that's like a pretty deep dive. I'll just say that it brings up some important realizations and issues. One of the issues is governance, because ultimately the function of creating money is a sacred function. In ancient times, it was the temples and the king that had the sacred right to create money. Money being, you imprint something onto this coin and it becomes something different because it has that imprint. In ancient times, coinage was not all gold and silver. Like they would make coins out of base metals that were then valuable because they had the imprint, the sacred imprint.
What about shells and things like that?
Yeah, that's this is a whole big topic. Let's not even go there.
All right.
Just the point being that to recover the sacred social function of money, it brings us to ask, how do we do that? If it isn't like central banks that are creating money, which isn't working very well right now, then how do we do this? Do we just give it to techno geeks with their algorithms and create it like with Bitcoin according to who has the most technical expertise and computer processing power? That doesn't seem like a very thoughtful way to do it. But at least Bitcoin and all of the cryptocurrencies are suggesting to us that we could create money in a million different ways. We don't have to assume that the central bank money that we've inherited is the only way to do it. There's an endless field of possibility, and the conversation needs to start. And crypto has instigated this conversation about how do we reclaim the sacred function of money creation as a society.
So you have some hopeful ideas about crypto?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of possibility there. And this is like the first iteration of a long process. There's a big learning curve here collectively. What money could become there's a lot of problems with the main cryptocurrencies right now as far as money goes. They're not really used as money. They're used as a speculative instrument. They're rarely used as a medium of exchange.
Yet, just in the last week or two, Coinbank went public and was valued more than General Motors, I believe. I mean, the numbers are crazy. And what fascinates me about it is with the blockchain aspect of crypto, it is the secrecy, the privacy aspects of it as well. So, any thoughts on those angles?
I mean, there's a lot to talk about there. Privacy is important when we are living in a tyrannical situation where the government is not trustworthy. You could imagine, though, like a more beautiful world in which it's kind of the opposite of privacy. It's transparency. The problem right now is that we're transparent to the government, but the government isn't transparent to us. We are alienated, generally speaking. I mean, in the US, something like 10 or 12% of people trust Congress. This is supposed to be a democracy. The Congress is supposed to be an organ of the people. It's not working. So of course we crave privacy and independence. But ultimately where we want to go is, and I'm not saying there should not be any privacy, but for me, like the society I want to live in is a society of trust, not cryptographic trustlessness, but trust and transparency. In a healthy society, wealth is visible, as it was when wealth consisted of land and cattle and camels. You could not hide your wealth. Therefore, you could not escape the social responsibilities that came with it.
Wealth and power require secrecy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And actually, crypto also has the potential to create transparency. So this technology can be used in so many ways that are just barely being discovered right now.
I think it's important that people understand crypto and understand blockchain and the elements that make it work. I think it is a part of our future that we're going to be living with more and more.
Yeah, I think so too.
So I wanted to make sure that we covered COVID-19 because you wrote about the coronation. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about coronavirus, COVID-19, and how it has affected us, how it maybe has made things better.
Yeah. How many hours do we have here?
About
from you?
5 minutes.
Okay. So yeah, coronation, I used that as a way to say that coronavirus is putting us at a choice point, because what a coronation is, it's an initiation into sovereignty, to make choices that had been unconscious before. And as a society, we are being faced with a choice that is still with us after over a year of COVID. A choice that is manifest because the response to COVID is showing us where we were already headed as a society. It wasn't just with COVID-19 that all of a sudden we began migrating life onto electronic media, that education was moving online, shopping moving online, dating moving online, people becoming more and more afraid, socially distanced. Like people were spending more and more time indoors already. People were more and more afraid of each other already. All the surveillance and censorship that's come along with COVID-19, that wasn't just all of a sudden starting either. So I believe we're being shown, and like this phobia for germs, and this mania for safety, like all of this stuff was already in motion. And now we're kind of being shown a preview of the future. This, what to me is a dystopia, but maybe to some is a utopia of perfect insulation from every threat, where you never hug a stranger, you never shake hands. You never gather in a circle. You never sing in a choir together again.
Where babies never fall down.
Where babies never fall down, right? This worship of safety is has many dimensions. Like the stuff that I did as a kid, running around outside, going back to the green space, playing in the stream unsupervised. If parents let their kids do that here, CPS would come and take the kids away. Why? Because safety, this is part of the old story of the separate self, whose safety and physical integrity is more important than anything else. So COVID is writing that large and putting it in front of our faces. And I think the choice I want to see come out of that, and which I am zealous about, is that we reclaim values beyond safety, beyond risk minimization. And we say, yeah, it is important to see each other's faces. It is important to sing together again. It is important to hold hands. It is important to gather in festivals, dances, weddings. And it's worth a reduction in our life expectancy, even if that's the case. But how much longer are we going to live when people are lonely and miserable and addicted and depressed anyway, and their immune systems aren't getting challenged? But even if we do suffer higher risk, it's still worth it. Like, Rob, if it would save your life, would you decree that nobody ever hug each other? Sorry, guys, to save me, you're never going to be able to hug again or gather again. Would you impose that on the world? No.
It's a tough one. Yeah.
I wouldn't. I'd be like, I don't want to, if children never got, but that's what we're doing as a society. Why? Because we're not holding those things valuable.
Well, when you asked me if I would do it, my thought is, well, I want to live. But the other side of it is, it's a ridiculous kind of a request that wouldn't happen anyway. That's the kind of rules that are made that are going to be broken.
Yeah. But it's kind of happening.
Yeah, and that's what's happening. I was reading today about how some vaccine deniers are wearing the gold star that were put on Jews in the Holocaust because they feel like they're being treated so terribly. And there's a part of me, I got my vaccination. I'm not anti-vax, but on the other hand, we've got to take a look at all of what's going on with open eyes. And I've struggled with it a lot because I publish a progressive website, and some of the people have gotten militantly anti everything having to do with COVID in terms of safety and things like that. Just like we see now that 40% of Republicans are not getting vaccinated. It's a tough balance to look at.
Yeah, and it is. Here's one thing that I can say for sure, is that it is impossible to know how safe and effective the vaccine is, especially long term. It's impossible to know just by looking at the media, because every side, every opinion now is familiar with the precepts of narrative warfare, where if something doesn't fit the narrative, you block it out. So given that, suppose the vaccine is much more unsafe than we're told. How would you know that?
Yeah.
If it were unsafe, if these stories of women like miscarrying and missing their menstrual cycles and et cetera, if those are true, how would you know it when they are systemically denied? You wouldn't know it. That doesn't mean that they are true, but it means if they were true in our current media environment, you would not know it.
I'm laughing because, I put these interviews on YouTube, and half of the shows I do are demonetized because of what people say. And you just did that for this one, which is fine.
Sorry, man. Maybe they won't listen to the end, though,
So we got to wrap. Any final words?
Just that I really appreciate this conversation, and that, like, I've been aware of op-ed news for a while, and I really appreciate that it's a place where there's some independent thought. And yeah, we may not agree on everything, but I trust that you are somebody who values that. And I think it came out in the conversation. So I really appreciate you, Rob.
And I haven't seen anything I disagree with you about, frankly. I love what you're saying and doing. So
Thank you.
my guest for the show has been Charles Eisenstein. He's an author and speaker known for his books, The Ascent of Humanity, Sacred Economics, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible, and Climate, A New Story. His website is charleseisenstein.org. Charles, thanks so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.